It kicked off on one of those blistering summer afternoons where the air feels thick enough to chew. The kind of day when the pavement radiates heat like a stovetop and even a breeze feels sticky. I was stretched out by my backyard pool, finally allowing myself a rare moment of calm when I spotted them. Karen and her husband, marching down my driveway with the kind of confidence you only see in people who believe the world revolves around them. Right then, I knew they hadn't come by accident. They were on a mission. Her husband, a broad man with a voice that seemed designed to dominate conversations, strode right up to the pool's edge without hesitation. He jabbed a finger toward the water and barked, "This pool belongs to us. We own this neighborhood." At first I chuckled, waiting for the punchline. But then I caught the fire in his eyes. No hint of sarcasm, no smirk. He truly believed he had some claim over my backyard. I stepped closer, trying to keep my face calm even though my chest tightened with disbelief. "Excuse me? This is my property. My backyard, my pool," I told him, forcing my voice to stay steady, but he wasn't backing down. He puffed up, squared his shoulders, and repeated louder, "We own the neighborhood. That pool is ours." It was so ridiculous it almost felt surreal, and yet I couldn't shake the unease crawling up my spine. I knew HOA disputes could get messy, but never in my life had I imagined someone would walk onto my land and outright lay claim to something I worked hard for. Karen stood just behind him, arms crossed, lips curled in that smug grin she was known for. She didn't need to say anything. Her expression alone told me she was enjoying every second of this circus. I took a slow breath, trying to think of how to de-escalate without letting them trample over me. But before I could get another word out, her husband clamped his hand on my fence post like he was staking his claim. That was it. My patience snapped. "You need to leave. Now," I said firmly, adrenaline making my hands tremble even as I stood my ground. The tension in the air was so thick it felt like the whole yard was holding its breath. For a brief second, I imagined this spiraling into one of those tragic news stories, neighbors clashing until things went too far. Not willing to take chances, I called the sheriff's office, keeping my voice as calm as I could while explaining that my so-called neighbors were attempting to take over my pool. When the deputies pulled up, Karen's husband straightened like he was preparing for a stage performance. He repeated his claim to the officers with all the confidence of a man who thought the law was on his side, and then it happened, something I'll never forget. The sheriff stared at him for a moment, raised one brow, and suddenly let out a booming laugh. The kind of laugh that shatters egos. It was almost cinematic. The man who claimed ownership over my property reduced to nothing more than a joke in front of real authority. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just surviving this confrontation, I was winning. But I also knew this wasn't the end. Karen and her husband weren't going to vanish quietly. This was only the beginning of a much larger battle. For the time being, though, the pool was still mine, and justice had arrived right when I needed it most. Karen's husband, his face scrunched like he'd bitten into a lemon, tried to recover. He jabbed a finger at me and barked, "You don't understand! There are rules here. You can't just do whatever you want." The irony almost made me laugh. Rules? Sure. But there were also deeds, titles, and very real property lines, and none of those backed up his fantasy. The deputies stood next to me, arms crossed, their expressions caught somewhere between boredom and disbelief. Just their presence was enough to reassure me I wasn't facing this madness alone. "Sir," the sheriff said, his tone low and firm, "this isn't your property. You don't own the pool. You need to leave." Karen's husband opened his mouth to argue again, but the sheriff cut him off with a sharp shake of his head. I said, "Leave." Karen leaned in and muttered something under her breath, still wearing that smug smile, but her confidence was cracking. Their ridiculous charade had collapsed in the face of the law. I wanted to throw a sharp comment their way, something clever to twist the knife. But I stayed quiet. Watching them back down in front of everyone was satisfaction enough. Sometimes the sweetest victory is simply letting karma run its course. As they retreated, I realized this entire ordeal wasn't just about a pool, it was about entitlement. About people who believed imaginary authority gave them the right to stomp over others. I thought of all the HOA horror stories I'd read online, of neighbors tearing each other apart over grass height or mailbox paint. But this was personal. My pool wasn't just a collection of tiles and water. It was my escape, my little piece of peace, and they had dared to threaten it. Once the deputies left, I took a slow lap around the pool, running my hand along the fence and glancing at the shimmering water. The sun bounced off its surface, a quiet reminder that the simple joys in life, like a backyard pool on a scorching day, are worth defending with everything you've got. After the sheriff left that first day, I called up a friend to vent. We laughed about the sheer absurdity of someone trying to claim ownership over my pool, but deep down, I knew it wasn't finished. Karen and her husband weren't the type to back down. If anything, humiliation only fueled them. Sure enough, within days, subtle signs of their retaliation began creeping in. Flyers stuffed into my mailbox, full of vague warnings about HOA compliance and community standards. Neighbors gave me side glances, whispers following me when I walked down the street. Karen's reach wasn't huge, but it was poisonous. Her influence spread through small acts of intimidation, and it was clear she wasn't going to let this go. That was the moment I made a decision. I wasn't just going to defend my pool, I was going to protect myself thoroughly. I started documenting every detail. Every flyer, every suspicious knock, every smug look tossed my way. If this were going to turn into a war, I would build a fortress of evidence. At first, it seemed like they'd licked their wounds and retreated after the sheriff's laughter had stripped away their false authority. But then the harassment picked up. More flyers, more ominous warnings, more attempts to create an illusion of control. They were playing the long game, hoping to wear me down with persistence. One morning, I spotted Karen's husband standing across the street, arms folded, glaring at my pool like a general surveying stolen land. He smirked when he caught my eye, even tipping an imaginary crown in mock authority. I waved back calmly, refusing to give him the reaction he wanted. Every instinct screamed at me to call him out, but I knew better. One wrong move and he'd twist it into aggression. Instead, I doubled down on my strategy. Facts, proof, documentation. I gathered everything. Photographs of the property lines, HOA payment receipts, even notes timestamping each ridiculous encounter. And then, the inevitable happened. A letter appeared, hand-delivered no less, dripping with fake authority. It accused me of aesthetic violations and demanded immediate changes to my pool area. The fine print even mentioned community ownership, as if they could rewrite reality with a paragraph of nonsense. That letter was the final straw. I called the sheriff again, explaining the escalation. The deputy on the line chuckled and reminded me that no matter how tricky HOA disputes could get, no one could simply declare ownership of another person's property. They advised me to keep documenting and, if needed, to involve the HOA board officially. It felt good knowing the law was firmly on my side, even if Karen and her husband were delusional enough to think otherwise. But their campaign of intimidation didn't stop. Every time I dipped into my pool, I imagined their eyes burning holes in me, their entitlement fueling their next move. It stopped being about water and tiles. It became about principle. About not letting ego and arrogance stomp over what's right. And then came the showdown. It was a Saturday morning, and I was enjoying a quiet swim when I noticed a familiar car crawling down my street. Trouble had arrived. Karen and her husband stepped out, armed with yet another flyer and the same smug expressions. But this time I was ready. I climbed out of the pool, the sun beating down, my resolve as solid as the ground under my feet. Her husband launched into his usual tirade, shouting about rules, ownership, and his supposed control over the neighborhood. His voice boomed louder than ever, desperate to intimidate. I let him finish, then calmly said, "You've made your claims, but the law and reality don't support you. Leave now or I'll call the sheriff again." For just a split second his eyes widened, surprise flashing across his face. He wasn't used to being challenged head-on. Karen opened her mouth to add something, but the thick tension hanging in the air silenced her. That's when I pulled out my trump card, a neatly organized folder. Inside was every piece of evidence I'd collected, photographs of property lines, HOA receipts, documentation of their harassment, and copies of every single flyer. I spread them out on the pool's edge like a lawyer laying down exhibits in court. Their faces dropped. For once, they had nothing to say. The couple who had tried to bulldoze me with arrogance was now cornered by cold, undeniable facts. I called the sheriff once more, speaking calmly, and within minutes, his deputies were standing in my yard. Karen's husband repeated his claims, voice cracking with frustration, but this time the sheriff cut him off with a sharp finality. You do not own this pool. You do not own the neighborhood. Leave before we take further action. That was it. Karen's husband turned red, sputtering and stammering, while Karen's mask of smug composure crumbled. With deputies watching, they had no choice but to retreat. They walked back to their car, humiliated, their silence louder than any threats they had made before. I stood there, watching them drive away, a smile tugging at my lips. Vindication washed over me like cool water on a scorching day. My pool, my sanctuary, was safe. And as the days passed, I noticed something had changed in the neighborhood. Word spread quickly. Whispers about the confrontation reached every porch and every kitchen table. Even some of Karen's allies kept their distance, as if realizing they'd hitched themselves to the wrong wagon. Finally, peace returned. I could sit by the pool without scanning the street for trouble, the sound of laughter replacing the anxiety that once lingered. Karen and her husband had tried to intimidate, to dominate, to control. But in the end, they lost to the one thing they couldn't bend, the law. My pool remained mine, a symbol of standing firm against arrogance and entitlement. And every time I glanced at the shimmering water, I couldn't help but chuckle, remembering the day the sheriff laughed in their faces. Justice doesn't always come swiftly, but when it does, it makes the entitled look very small. The battle was over. The pool was safe. And I had one unforgettable story to tell.